Hi, this is Allenna Leonard, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about an informal commentary on the U.S. political situation using some cybernetic concepts. One exercise that never failed in workshops I did with Stafford was to ask the participants to look at the morning paper and list all the stories that demonstrated a lack of requisite variety, and his statement that the purpose of a system is what it does. High variety challenges are met with low variety public debate and a host of missing or perverted feedback loops. One hardly knows where to begin, but I'll concentrate on three examples: race relations, the COVID response, and the electoral process. An accounting on race relations is long overdue, beginning with the rose-colored history that was all many of us learned until well into adulthood. Right now, the flashpoint is police brutality, although that is only the sharp end of a 400-year complex situation. From the headlines and captured by cell phone videos, it has become increasingly obvious that the shared subjectivity of communities of color regarding police is far different than that of white communities. Feedback loops amplify this distinction in a number of ways with perverse incentives and disconnected homeostats. Recruitment and the variety of training and equipment police are provided does not match the variety of the situations they face on the ground, many of which call for the perspective of the social worker, psychologist, or anthropologist. Police are trained and outfitted as if they were warriors in an occupying army, yet much of what they enforce amounts to the criminalization of homelessness, drug addiction, and mental illness, and other crimes of poverty. Problematic officers are routinely promoted. Even if fired, their records do not travel with them to the next community, and they are free to continue their misbehavior. Fatal encounters and excessive use of force in black communities is an unsurprising outcome in the absence of accountability, racism, and de-escalation. Many municipalities have already defunded the police in that they have required police to cover much of their budgets from fines and fees. This leads to over-policing of disadvantaged communities and communities of color because they have little voice, and a subsequent and justified belief that not only undermines trust and gives freer rein to actual criminals, but makes people in these communities feel they have targets on their backs. For-profit prisons are another perverse feedback loop. A judge in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, where I actually grew up, received a kickback for each juvenile he sent to the detention center. He was finally sent to prison for these actions, but less egregious incentives remain beginning but not ending with sentencing disparities between minority and white offenders, charging inmates exorbitant prices for all but the most basic necessities of life. Sentencing and probation recommendations are increasingly governed by the application of algorithms that reinforce inequality and racial discrimination. On COVID, the United States is the only developed country with an administration that has made the pandemic response a partisan effort in the service of its election prospects. From initial dismissal to refusing to initiate a national strategy to continued shortages of PPE, tests, and tracing, the U.S. response has led to being a nation with 4% of the world's population and 22% of its COVID deaths. There's also poor prospects for care for the after effects on those who survive and inadequate funds to pay for them. It's been an invitation for medical suppliers to charge whatever the market will bear for tests and treatment, including to the many millions who've lost their health insurance when they lost their jobs. It also turns out that only the uninsured patients with a clear-cut COVID diagnosis, minus other factors, will qualify for the hospital reimbursement through the administration's COVID treatment initiative. There will be volumes written on this, but I'd just like to highlight the communications cluster of cybernetics concepts. Instead of clear messages, which were provided by some governors, the administration introduced noise by setting guidelines one day and encouraging people to ignore them the next, and floating unproven treatments. It also seems to have pressured the CDC to relax recommendations on testing, causing damage to their credibility. Since March, there has been an avalanche of noise and misinformation on social media, denying the virus, its seriousness, and its death toll. Meanwhile, sensible public health precautions, many lifted from the 1918 pandemic, such as wearing masks, hand washing, and social distancing, were forged into a cultural war, and statements of individual freedom versus conspiracy theories. Where were the filters and guardrails that are normal protections? Regarding the election, does the electoral process have requisite variety to present a fair choice of candidates or directions? Does it come close to the ideal one person, one vote? I cannot think it does. The current political and electoral mechanisms cannot address the variety of challenges and are not fit for purpose. For instance, the process for choosing nominees for the presidency relies on the influence of 4 mostly rural February primary caucus states with less than 4% of the population. In the general election, 6 swing states representing about 20%, and this year perhaps just Wisconsin with less than 6% of the population, may determine the outcome of a close election, making participation of most voters moot. Due to compromises concerning slavery in 1790, the Electoral College was established rather than electing the president by popular vote as the northern states preferred. This now antiquated process has yielded a win for the party with fewer popular votes twice since the turn of the century. Money amplifies the influence of wealthy individuals, industries, and interest groups. Campaigns are very expensive and have, despite campaign finance law, virtually no limits on individual donations. And since Citizens United, there are no limits on corporate spending, as they are now considered persons entitled to First Amendment rights. Attenuation of voter preference is advanced by an array of voter suppression tactics, including strict voter ID requirements that many who do not have passports or driver's licenses cannot meet, closing or moving polling places in low-income areas, disenfranchising people with felony convictions, hacking voting machines, especially in states with no paper trail, and limitations on where and when people can register. This year, with many voters choosing to vote by mail, confidence is eroded by baseless accusations of likely fraud and, intentionally or not, by slowdowns in the Postal Service and disproportionate removals of mailboxes and sorting machines. Further attenuation results from discouraging voters from intimidation, misinformation, and propaganda to discourage voters. It has been less an exercise in putting forward platforms for public debate and more about getting out the base and discouraging the others. Here are some comments from the perspective of Stafford Beer's viable system model, beginning with System 5, which handles identity and coherence. Mass media and social media have made it difficult to avoid seeing the ways in which a mirror held up to the United States reflects a very mixed and inconsistent picture. Without the Cold War or comparable external threat, the contrast between the lived experience of many and the stated ideals is stark. The individualism that has characterized the United States downloads the risks and costs of social and economic change to those least able to absorb them, with minimal protection against the excesses of capitalism and a minimal safety net. Fear of the other, deaths of despair, and an acceptance of a fundamentalist or authoritarian set of answers are within easy reach of the disoriented individual. It's up to the individual or the identity group to construct a model of a world in which they have a place, but a national shared picture remains elusive. Unlike Canada and some other countries, there are no equalization payments to make sure that states with fewer resources do not remain stuck in poverty. In contrast, Canada makes transfer payments from the well-off to the less well-off provinces. Alberta, now a wealthy province, received such payments before the discovery of oil, and the maritime provinces, once wealthy, now received them. In the U.S., block grants and other special supports are not close to sufficient, although citizens in wealthy states do pay more in taxes to the federal government than they receive in benefits. System 4 and the future. The United States lacks a comprehensive view of the future or possible futures of the country and seems to have a very high variety of perspectives on what the future environments might be. Special projects, like those of NASA or No Child Left Behind, tackle one issue at a time. This leads to operational decisions, normally the province of System 3, to be taken with an eye to competing identities rather than alternative futures. System 3 looks for synergy among the System 1 elements and their relationships with their environments. It typically engages in substantial resource bargaining with respect to resources to advance program initiatives. It governs by legislation and executive order, but often without the comprehensive modeling of potential unintended consequences that a functioning System 4 would provide. The departments are in charge of writing the regulations to implement the law, but they may not be strictly enforced depending on the resources allocated. System 3-star, outside of finance, is often unofficial and performed by special commissions or congressional hearings. System 2 is supposed to make the system run smoothly. Much is administrative, but it is often playing catch-up when regulations of different departments clash. For the federal government, the System 1 activities under their direct control of the departments that implement laws and regulations within their domains. Except for defense and state, and to a certain extent commerce, their environments seem to be program areas, regions, or states, but not the country as a whole. States are a lower level of recursion and have a great deal of autonomy, including laws about voting with national implications. There's a nonprofit voluntary uniform law commission that attempts to reconcile such differences, but there's no recommendation that they must apply in their state legislatures. These comments barely scratch the surface of what could be said about a cybernetic diagnosis of the United States and its government, but I hope it will encourage more thinking about Ashby's law of requisite variety and how it applies to governance. Thank you very much.